Hello, everyone. My name is Richard Medhurst. Thank you for joining this special panel today. All the participants in this event are colleagues of mine. They're journalists who have covered the Julian Assange extradition case and this saga for years alongside me inside the court. They were with me in the trenches, so to speak, and they've been there the entire duration, either virtually or in person or both. And remarkably, this is almost all of the journalists who have done this in total, which is, a shocking number. Among those journalists who are missing from today's panel are Stefania Maurizi, Dustin Hoffman, Craig Murray, Chris Hedges, Moritz Müller. But nevertheless, the number itself goes to show you how mainstream media completely abdicated their duty to uphold freedom of the press. But I'm very happy that all of you have taken the time to come here and have this conversation about the Assange case, about the mainstream media's role and how it came, how this plea deal came about, and anything else you want to touch on. So perhaps we could begin with Mary, and I'm going to go around the table virtually and ask all of you, what was your reaction when you saw Julian get free, and what was your reaction to the plea deal?
Well, first of all, I was enormously relieved. And just let me say before I go on, Richard, thank you for asking me on. It's such a pleasure to share a platform with all the people, some of the people that whose work I've admired over so many years now. Yeah, I was enormously relieved. I'm sure we all were. We knew it was happening. We expected it. And, we waited nervously to see if it was actually going to get over the line. I'm relieved about the plea deal. I think it's really important. It was important for him. He's pleaded guilty to journalism. That's what it amounts to. And the second thing I'm very pleased about is that it does not set a legal precedent. However, it has set a terrible political precedent, and we've yet to see what appetite the US has to continue to pursue journalists in this way. As for Julian, I think he obviously is in a situation where he's had skin ripped off mentally, psychologically, emotionally, and physically. And I think he just needs time to recover before he confronts the world, really. He's in this, as he said, it feels surreal after 15 years to be a free man, and he has to adjust to that. So I won't go any further because I'd like to hear what everyone else has to say as well.
Thanks, Mary.
Mohamed, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Again,
sorry.
There are no rules. Feel free to jump in anytime.
Okay.
I'm not going to restrict you.
Yeah. Well, you're now going to discover what it means for there to be no rules when people are used to being on a panel where they're asked to speak. Okay. So thank you as well, Richard, for asking us. It's great to see everybody here. I don't know what the different countries are that people are based in. Some of them actually, no, that's not true. I do know some of them. It's good to see Taylor and Tareq, Kevin, who I was communicating with till about 3 or 4 in the morning, my time last night, Joe and Mary as well. So I woke up, so I got the news about Julian by chance. I for some reason wasn't sleeping well and got up for a glass of water and broke a rule I don't normally break, which is I looked at my phone. And, I was still sleep deprived, and I'm looking at my phone, and someone had messaged me from Berlin, like, so this is pretty amazing stuff about Julian, right? And I'm like, I don't know what that's about. And then for some reason, I go to the WikiLeaks Twitter handle, and I see a tweet which announces the fact that like a deal has been had. It literally took me like an hour for my brain to fully I didn't believe it. Like I didn't fully believe it. Like part of my brain was like, is this, oh, this thing has just happened. And the other part of my brain is like, no, you're imagining this, or this is one of those examples of fake kind of information that just gets spun around quickly, because that happens a lot. Because I've just dumped a cache of all this shocking information. I keep having to message people saying, A, stop sending me this stuff. B, WikiLeaks announces what they publish on their website and via their social media. So I was saying that to a family member as well. So I didn't fully believe it. It took a while for me to comprehend it. I tweeted out some information. One of them was slightly inaccurate. I said he's on his way to Australia, when in fact, technically he was, but with a detour to Saipan first. And then after I woke up in the morning, that's when it really started to settle in, because more and more clips and more information and video clips were coming out. So it's on the one hand, it's amazing. On the other hand, I do wish I like, this has got nothing to do with Julian, obviously, but I do kind of wish we had some form of resolution at the appeal, because having followed it now for the better part of for over 5 years, it does feel like we were robbed of a positive decision.
Yeah.
In the courts, and in fact, I think the evidence is clear that the Americans were rightly afraid that they would lose. The only concern is, how long could they have kept it going, including appealing, losing at the appeal, and how much would Julian's health have degraded? That's the real issue there, because I think, if we won't go, I won't go into it now, but the First Amendment, the possibility, the high likelihood that Julian might be prejudiced at trial due to his citizenship or nationality, they had no way of guaranteeing to the High Court that that wouldn't be the case, especially since they had already given an affidavit that might be the case. So there is that, basically. There is the sort of, I wish he had been fully cleared, and it's incredibly frustrating that he was essentially coerced into accepting a guilty plea, albeit to a single charge, and contrary to what Matthew Miller, is that his name, Kevin? Is it Matthew Miller, the spokesman?
Yeah.
At one point during his press briefing, he said, during the amazing press briefing, where he clearly had a rehearsed statement about all the things WikiLeaks did wrong, and when he was asked questions about it, he's like, well, this was 15 years ago. Like, I don't know the details. I wasn't there. It's like, well, then why did you just give this whole... Anyway.
Well, Mohamed, there was a
Yeah.
positive outcome. The positive outcome, yesterday morning, the Eastern District of Virginia dropped the case. It's over. The whole computer hacking thing, gone. They won. Assange won this case. And as far as there is no legal precedent, because an appeals court hasn't decided this. There's no real political precedent, in my view, because that was set by Franklin Roosevelt in 1942, when he tried to indict Chicago Tribune reporters for reporting that the U.S. had broken the code over the Midway. And the grand jury in that case didn't return an indictment. And then Nixon also tried to indict the New York Times reporters on the Pentagon Papers case. And that had to be, he impaneled a grand jury in Boston, and that had to be dropped because it was learned that about the prosecutorial misconduct, that they had tapped Ellsberg's phone, which meant they also tapped the New York Times reporter's phone. So that was dropped. This was the only time it was successfully done. So they've already tried to use the Espionage Act against reporters. The problem, as Julian's statement in that courtroom in Saipan is that, yes, he broke the law as it's written, but as it's written, it's unconstitutional because, as he said, the First Amendment contradicts it completely. This is the problem with the Espionage Act, and I hope that his case highlights that. Had he gone to Virginia and had they challenged whatever decision is to go to the Supreme Court, that would have been a more dramatic way to do this. But I think his appeal points out that, yes, he did break the law the way it's written. Technically, it says in the Espionage Act that anyone possessing or disseminating it is liable to this. And this is the real problem here. Now, Tlaib, the congresswoman from Michigan, has put forward amendments that would make it only applicable to government employees who have written or signed non-disclosure agreements, but that's not the way it is right now. So this is the real problem, and I think it's a great victory for Julian Assange. I think he kicked their butts. And here in Australia, where I am now in Canberra, Albanese is getting killed by the opposition because he was the first one to call him, and he's treating him like a hero. And they're calling him in the Murdoch press here a convicted felon, just like we heard in the debate, right? Convicted felon. Convicted felon. He's a convicted felon. How could he call him? And Penny Wong, the foreign minister here, also said, you know, he better not leak anything because we have laws against that too. She's either stupid or willfully saying those things because she knows that he doesn't leak. He's not the leaker. He's the publisher of leaks. So he won. I think it's a great day.
I mean, he was forced into custody, of some form of custody, for 14 years. And yeah, so he won the legal side of things, although not when I said I wish we'd heard from in the appeal, I mean from the UK side. It would have been nice to have the High Court say, because that would be precedent. That would mean no one would ever be able to be extradited to the United States if there was a risk that they might be prejudiced based on nationality, which would mean they would legally have to change the Espionage Act at the very least to say foreign citizens, foreign nationals, non-US persons explicitly have the same First Amendment rights as US persons, however good or terrible they may be. So that would have been, and I think they were concerned they would have gotten a decision like that, because from the High Court, that would then have presidential value that would impact all future cases of a similar nature. I mean, with a similar fact pattern, i.e. prosecuting journalists and publishers for publishing outside of the United States national security or so-called national defense information. So
Good point.
You know, that's the point, the perspective actually I was coming from. Obviously, it was amazing to see him hugging Stella and his dad, John Shipton, and all the rest of it. And it's it's the first time I actually felt excited. You know, I've been enthusiastic at points, etc., but the first time I've actually been excited in this case, and it took a while to set in. Sort of like when you finish your exams in high school or at university, you know, typically there's was it anticlimactic because it hasn't fully set in that, like, oh, this part of my life is over. I was saying to Kevin, I almost feel bad. I said, I don't know what I'm going to do now. This has consumed my life since 2019.
Yeah.
You know, I totally feel that too, Mo. I feel that, you know, this has been a collective effort among all of us. We've all worked together at some point throughout these extradition proceedings, in particular within the past 4 years. I also do want to reiterate that I have the same sentiment that you have, Joe. I also think that this was a legal victory for Julian Assange. And again, when you weigh the victory, or if this is a win for Assange, I look at the realistic outcomes at this point in time with this case. So the chances of extradition, if this were to continue, I think were quite high. Of course, there was always the possibility that this case could have been won within the UK domestic courts, and that he would be protected from facing extradition to the United States, but only within the UK. But say if he were to be extradited, which was quite possible, the precedent that could have been set if he was tried in the U.S. Eastern District Court of Virginia, which we know is a very unfair court, he would have likely been found guilty on multiple charges, perhaps, which would have set a judicial precedent and which would have an even worse impact, I think, on press freedom. So I think that this was a good outcome legally. And then, of course, as we know, this is a good outcome for Assange personally, for his family. He could finally be with his sons, his wife, friends, and family. So I think that I've seen a lot of people suggest that this is not a legal win. Yes, a precedent has been set from the prosecution itself. But at this point in time, when you look at the possibilities, I think this was a good outcome for him. And I think that we're all maybe a little bit grateful that we are able to put this to rest now. But I think that we can expect some more information to be put forward perhaps in the future. Maybe not at this point in time, but as time progresses, we should maybe expect some more information related to this case and more.
And just Mo, I have a question for you actually on this point of precedent, because I feel like you might know the answer better than me. In terms of the UK courts, does it set any sort of precedent in that respect, even though the case didn't reach its full conclusion. For the thing that I'm thinking about is, we had all this debate about the Extradition Act versus the Extradition Treaty, and they ruled that the treaty, the protections in the treaty don't hold weight, and it was the act, the wording of the act that was that took precedent, that was the authority in this case. So yeah, my understanding is that it would still that kind of does set a precedent in that respect, even though the case doesn't.
I think Beretsa is the one that really screwed us in terms of precedents with her 2021 decision. Because as you all know, she blocked it on health grounds, but she agreed with the rest.
Yes, except the High Court. So magistrates' courts can't bind other like district judges can't bind other district judges if they're both sitting in the magistrates' court, right? You're bound. It's higher courts that have the precedential value. I mean, it can be persuasive. So if a future case, a district judge could look to see what their fellow district judge, Judge Beretsa decided when she was presiding over Assange's extradition case, but they wouldn't be bound completely by her decision the way it would be by a high court or court of appeal precedent or Supreme Court precedent. And of course, within extradition cases, now you skip the court of appeal, but the court of appeal can still make decisions. However, you're right, Tareq, that a number of the rulings made in this case by the High Court, such as that the wording of extradition treaties, if the Extradition Act in the UK is silent on extraditing people for political offenses, but like 99% of all the treaties the UK signs explicitly prohibits extraditing people for a number of things, and one of them is for political offenses. So what they said is, well, okay, it's Parliament's treaty, it's Parliament's act that matters, not the treaty, and it's silent. So we're going to choose to interpret that silence as overriding the explicit provision that the UK government went through the whole process of negotiating with the United States, presumably with Canada, all the other countries. So they're saying that this was all just fanfare, that when the UK government is negotiating treaties, that by the way, if the roles were reversed and you're in the United States and the Brits want you, you have protection of extradition over political offenses because they're not interpreting their laws that way. So yeah, there are a number of shockingly terrible decisions, particularly from the High Court, because they are a higher court, that have.
No. He froze. Richard, before we go on, I just want to let you know that my colleague Cathy Vogan is in the waiting room.
Magistrates courts, because that's where 90 magistrates.
Let me add her in. Thank you for telling me, because it just popped up. Thank you.
Sorry, did I freeze?
You did freeze.
Well,
for a long time. Did any of it get through?
Nothing.
We heard some of you. But let me just jump in, because I thought it was an extraordinary moment when Julian Assange sat there in that courtroom and basically pleaded guilty to journalism. I mean, I wrote a book with that as the framing, and it was my insistence the whole time in covering this case that Julian Assange was a journalist. And in fact, I disagreed constructively with a lot of the press freedom organizations and other organizations that were advocating for Julian Assange's freedom, that would say it didn't matter because the First Amendment. I wrote a book with that as the framing, and it was my insistence the whole time Cathy, in covering this case that Julian Assange was a journalist. And in fact, I disagreed constructively with a lot of the press freedom organizations and
there's some
other
feedback, I think
organizations that were advocating for Julian Assange's freedom that would say it didn't matter.
Cathy, that might be you. Do you have it audio playing?
She just muted herself. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, I'll continue. I disagreed with this idea because I felt like it was giving too much ground to the US government, because it was clear to me that part of what emboldened them to bring this Espionage Act prosecution was because they could say so clearly that Julian Assange was not a journalist. So I didn't think it was good enough for us to continually point out, although it was true, that he engaged in standard news gathering activities, because there was a demonization that had been effective. We know that That's an aspect of every single Espionage Act prosecution, at least going back to, well, you can extend it back to Daniel Ellsberg because that's the model case that the Justice Department has been running off. But if you really look at those chunks of cases with whistleblowers like John Kiriakou and Thomas Drake and Daniel Hale and other whistleblowers that have been targeted, it's really dependent on tearing the person down so that you can make it easier to bring these cases forward. So I definitely took issue with that. But you asked earlier, and I figure I'll go ahead and give you my reaction to learning this news, having spent so much time alongside all of you who did a remarkable job doing coverage. That I got a phone call. I don't believe this is private information I need to keep. CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou gave me a phone call and was telling me that this was all over. And he said, "Did you see what happened?" And I'm thinking, did somebody die? Because he was very serious. And I didn't have any idea. I had not been on social media. And then he said, "Yeah, well, Julian Assange just pled guilty. He's out." And so then I hopped on and was doing coverage immediately. But that just shows you how, it was really abrupt, but I encourage anyone who sees this conversation to go read the access journalism that was published by the Washington Post in the last 24 hours that describes just how miserably this all collapsed for the Justice Department, because we could tell from Julian Assange's legal team, from the statements they were making during the press briefings, that this was working out in their favor, that the Justice Department came to them interested in negotiating. But it's actually even more incredible for Julian Assange's team if you read the Washington Post story. Actually, when I read this Washington Post story, I could only think of another example of access journalism working in our favor, which was the Yahoo News report that revealed key details about Mike Pompeo and the CIA targeting Julian Assange and discussing plans to kidnap or assassinate him. This is a nice record of how basically they bailed on the Julian Assange case because they knew they were going to lose in the appeals court, and they didn't want to lose in the context of an extradition request. So they decided to end it on their own terms.
Well, not completely. It was Julian's terms too. It was a negotiation.
Yeah. And he got incredibly favorable terms.
Yeah, actually, even better, which is the point that Kevin and I made in our article. I'm not saying we're the only ones who did this. By the time we finished the piece, it was too late for me to read anyone else's. I needed to sleep. But I ended up getting stuck with the presidential debates, but that's another matter. But one of the points was, and this is the point that Barry Pollock made during the press conference, it's also in the plea agreement. If he had won at the appeal stage, which I believe that he had a strong case of winning because the Americans had put themselves in a corner. They had previously said, given affidavits saying that there's a real possibility, given various case law, they cited various examples, that Julian, because he's a non-US citizen and a non-US person, he would not be entitled to First Amendment protections, right? And then that then backfired against them when the judges are like, hold on a second, because the defense raised this. You're saying he wouldn't have the same rights to raise First Amendment arguments as a US citizen? That can't be possible, because even in the UK, as draconian as things can be here, we have a Human Rights Act. And so however strong or weak the freedom of speech, freedom of press protections would be here, they pertain to human beings, not citizens or nationals or what have you. That's one of the reasons why there's so much of the establishment here, political establishment, don't like the Human Rights Act.
Yeah.
They don't think there should be equal rights for those basic fundamental rights. So there is they back themselves into a corner, and it's very clear, even from the wording of the judgment of the high court judges, that they were increasingly skeptical, right? That at first they're like, oh, just give us some assurances that he'll be treated equally in terms of the First Amendment, and then they couldn't. So, but anyway, Barry Pollock, the point he made was, and that's in the plea agreement as well, that even if he'd won, that would only have related to this case. which related to the publishing activities WikiLeaks engaged in from 2009 to 2011, right? The Iraq war logs, Afghanistan war diaries, Guantanamo Bay detainee files, and the Cablegate diplomatic cables. It would not have, they could have then still sought his extradition, perhaps from somewhere else, right? Based on other publications. So he might have been able to leave the UK, and they could have said, well, what about Vault 7, the CIA cyber warfare tools that he published? We want to go after him for that. So the plea agreement protects him for prosecution for any conduct, publishing activities he's engaged in up to the date of signing of the plea agreement, which was what, yesterday or 2 days ago now. My brain is all the days are merging into each other, right? That's amazing. So actually, that's a very good deal.
Well, the problem with the Americans is that then they will go and say, well, how do you define publishing? He's a spy.
No, it's conduct.
So we start all over again.
Conduct.
I know, but the thing is, I would always be vigilant with anything they sign, because most of the world understands that when you sign a document, it actually has value in a court. But again, I'm glad it worked out. I think the moment they let him out of the prison, it was clear that it's over, because they would have never let him out. And I heard that because you were all talking about the deal collapsing. The case collapsing and then them going to a deal. I agree with you 100% that they backed themselves into a corner, and how ironic that it was all about the First Amendment in the end. I also understood that they were going to ask or had asked Mendoza to come do oral arguments. So I was looking forward to that immensely. But of course, the great pleasure here is seeing Julian walk free. But again, this should have happened a lot sooner. Cathy, I see Cathy is now with us. Do you want to just give us, briefly before we move on to the next thing, your reaction when you saw that Julian was finally free?
Well, I don't know what Joe said. I'm very sorry. I was in waiting room limbo for a while. But it was the last thing in the world that we expected. They kept this really under wraps. But we can assume that it was planned for a long time. It was planned at the very highest level in Australia. We had the Australian ambassador to the UK, Stephen Smith. We had the ambassador to Australia, Kevin Rudd, who was Australia's former prime minister, and we had various people who were, Barry Pollock. We hadn't heard from him for quite a long time. Jennifer Robinson, of course, Gareth Peirce, who we saw appeared at Stansted Airport, who seemed to be looking over the final papers. Not a word was breathed to us, and we are very close to, friendly with the people in WikiLeaks. So Joe and I had been up in Northumberland and climbed Hadrian's Wall. We caught the train back to London. It was after midnight. Joe heard a sound in the bathroom, from the radio. He heard two words. He heard Espionage Act and he heard Australia, and he went, oh my goodness, that must be something about Julian. And it was on the BBC. And he said, well, that means it must be big news. And then it was like, oh my God, he's free. He's left the UK. This is when we heard about it. We're not going to sleep this night. And we didn't, of course. And then hours later, we jumped on a plane to come back here to Australia. And here in Australia, well, I don't know if you can see the little illustration that I've done behind. There is an incredible emotion here in Australia because, look, you've got the government, you've got the opposition, you've got 3/4 of the parliament. There was a motion passed, to do everything, go all out to get Julian home, and 3/4 of our politicians voted for. And you've got 90% of the population. So can you imagine what it's like to get this amazing asset home
Yeah.
You know, it really means a lot to people in Australia. They are very emotional about it. And, you know, there are so many activist groups here, more than there are in the UK. And, you know, they were all reporting, you know, at this scene here, that they were crying tears of joy at, you know, a very human scene of a family being reunited. We learned that Stella had traveled there. We didn't know at all that we're invited to Julian's birthday party in the UK, which is supposed to happen, you know, next week, a little after his birthday. But, you know, we weren't told that it was off. And now, well, I'm actually planning a birthday party for Julian in Sydney, and an open mic, so that with speakers, you know, with some of the great people that have worked so hard, the long haulers. You know, I'm not going to mention names because I haven't invited them yet, but also an open mic for some of those great activists who have worked since 2010, you know, people who have become family to me, and people that I've met from around the world, actually. But to let them speak, Chris Hedges wrote an article for us in Consortium News and said that all of these people must be thanked. And, you know, we'll sing happy birthday, I suppose, to Julian. Maybe he'll join us. It'll be live in a venue, a very nice venue. Where I've you know, produced Politics in the Pub. That's a 30-year-old event, which may wind up soon because people have just got old. But we're going to do this event for Julian Assange, and we have done many events in the past. We've had a lot of, you know, we've had even Albo come and speak there, and many of the politicians that are in the Bring Assange Home cross-parliamentary group, and it's very important, that cross-parliamentary aspect of it. So, you know, we're inviting everybody along. We can get it probably maybe 150, maybe 200 people in. And
I
just
just want to point out, Cathy, that Chris Hedges
their
did not write
stories.
that. Hedges wrote
Oh.
that for SharePost we republished.
Oh,
and
for
he didn't write
SharePost.
for
For
us.
SharePost.
You know, I'm looking at this Washington Post story, Kevin, and it's really extraordinary because, as Cathy and I discussed privately, it became clear when the U.S. will very likely lose this case, and because it was narrowed down to that First Amendment issue, and it would violate British extradition law based on the European Convention, which required that he have that guarantee. Once the U.S. couldn't give that assurance, looks like they were going to lose, and they're openly saying that in this Washington Post article. It's quite an extraordinary piece. They were going to lose. That's why they did this deal. It's amazing.
Well, that's exactly what Stella Assange said. There was a press conference in the Australian Parliament with Jennifer Robinson, Barry Pollock, and Stella Assange, and she said, and this is what I imagined. I sort of felt that this was happening too. The things started to move very quickly, and in fact it was the United States that took the initiative and tried to move things forward quickly. And things did get negotiated somewhat in Julian's favor because, as Barry Pollock said, he would not plead guilty to anything that he knew was patently false. This whole hacking scenario, which was just bullshit. However, and I don't know if you guys have read the plea agreement. The full thing is 23 pages. There is one really egregious clause, which we have come to call the indemnity clause. And that prevents Julian from, you know, seeking any, you know, restitution after the violation of his human rights, and, you know, in any country of the world. I mean, they specify it in the United States, in Australia, in the UK, and worldwide. He can't do a frigging thing to, you know.
This is a very American thing, which they've done this in other countries where they for example, in Spain, which again, I'm going to circle back to Mendoza because his case is so relevant to Julian's. He also, for example, wanted to seek damages, and by the time he'd gotten back to Spain, they had passed a law where you couldn't sue the United States anymore. So, it's amazing.
That's right.
It's amazing.
Yes, and Julian, another clause is that Julian is not, or any of his representatives, none of them are entitled to any more discovery on this case, on the investigation, on everything that happened. However, in Stella's speech at Parliament House, she turned to the press and she said, "But you can, and I hope you do. I strongly encourage you to submit freedom of information requests, because that's the way we're going to find out. We must unravel all of this injustice that has happened to Julian Assange over the years."
Well, Cathy, let me use that to transition to something. And again, if anyone wants to add something, please feel free. But I want to talk about the media, because you guys, you were in the trenches. You did all this work. We all went to court together. We had sleepless nights. We worked tirelessly, and the mainstream media, they didn't do a thing. I mean, they only perhaps recently, in the last months, began to maybe seriously talk about Julian's case. But I want to ask you guys about your feelings regarding the mainstream media, about their coverage, about their lack of coverage. Their lack of of both coverage and courage simultaneously, and the fact that when Julian needed them the most, he was stabbed in the back by these people, and many of them had even profited from WikiLeaks by working together on previous stories. So, just what do you think of the mainstream media and what they did?
I'll jump in here. Could I start with the first day of the extradition hearing in September, when James Lewis addressed the press directly, and he drew a wedge between Julian Assange and the mainstream media, and he said, "This is not about you. You are not under threat. This guy is a hacker," whatever he called them. And to cut a long story short, at the end of the morning, they all left. They didn't come back for the afternoon session, where they would have discovered that they were equally under threat, that they too could be indicted under the Espionage Act. And, there's a combination of laziness as well, to some extent, and perhaps they're covering a lot of other jobs. Independent journalists tend to focus on, especially if they're not paid, on the things that they're really interested in and the things that really matter. But if you're working for a boss, you're covering all kinds of stories, and it's probably more superficial. But it suited them. I think there was fear as well.
Taylor, you wanted to jump in, and then I think Kevin and Tareq as well. Let me hear what you guys think of the media.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to point out that, of course, over the past, let's say, 10 years or so, the media support has increased. In particular, I would say within the past 3 to 4 years, once the persecution against Assange continued to become more extreme, I think people were waking up to the fact that this is a case that we need to look into further. This is an individual we should support. Of course, we would have wanted the mainstream media to be more attentive to this case, to report factually on the matter. I think all of us also can agree that we've spent probably a lot of time having to dismantle some of the intentional disinformation that has been put forth from the US, from the UK prosecutors with regard to this case, in particular with the hacking allegations, which have been reported unfairly or at least misrepresented by the mainstream media, as well as this false idea that WikiLeaks publications led to the harm of informants or those working with intelligence. And I think that goes back to a really good outcome with regard to this plea deal, is that it helps put an end to these baseless, blatant pieces of disinformation. Because, of course, as was mentioned earlier, the plea deal did not include elements of the CFA charge, that is the conspiracy to commit computer intrusion charge. And also the judge said in open court as well in Saipan that she acknowledged there was no evidence whatsoever that anybody had been harmed as a result of WikiLeaks publication. So I was very pleased to see that perhaps we could finally get to the day where the mainstream media and the general public will be able to accept these two pieces of information as fact here. And hopefully we'll see a turn, and the trend will continue in the direction that it's been going in for the past few years. Now, I was interested to hear that in Australia, the reporting doesn't seem to be, from the mainstream media, doesn't seem to be as favorable. That's interesting. I haven't come across that, but I think that this is also
That's the right-wing press, Tail, just the right-wing press.
okay.
In fact, the ABC had wall-to-wall hours and hours of live coverage of the moment the plane arrived, the hug, interviews.
Yeah.
It was the biggest story here. I mean, Julian Assange will not have to pay for a dinner or a drink for the rest of his life in Australia. And Stella is the queen of Australia. So the ABC and Sydney Morning Herald, they were very positive about it. The right-wing press are calling him the king.
Yes, our national broadcaster is absolutely supportive. They're pretty much aligned with the government as usual. And there is no shadow of a doubt that Julian was wronged. And I mean, you've got the Prime Minister that doesn't want to commit to any particular argument against what some people are saying. Is he really a journalist and all that? He doesn't want to get involved in that. All he is saying is, job done, right?
Right.
This is what we wanted to do. We brought him back. That's it.
Right. Good to hear. I also do think, just quickly, and I'll let the others weigh in on this, but I think that the American public generally have been very disappointed in this case, and that over time, as they've learned more information, that people generally did not support this continued prosecution. I also think that was a problem for the United States. Yes, sure, there was a lot of people who were not educated on the facts, but I do think that it was becoming increasingly unfavorable. People saw this for what it was, which was a threat to press freedom and a threat to the First Amendment. Again, all going back to the great work of everybody here, the journalists fairly covering the case, as well as those protesters, the campaigners, and those who were behind the scenes doing this great work, and of course the legal team.
Yes.
Yeah, I can just quickly jump in here and say that, you know, we all know, I can put an exclamation point on what everyone else has said here, that the media played a role in aiding and abetting this prosecution. You can look at the indictment against Julian Assange and find examples that were referenced by US prosecutors. You can see that they're referring to New York Times blog postings that claim the Taliban has used the files to claim that they basically they assert that they found a name of an individual, they executed that person, something to that nature. And we know from Chelsea Manning's court-martial that was a lie, because it was said in open court and the defense for Chelsea Manning caught it, and the judge shut it down and said, you know, I will not accept that anybody was killed by the Taliban in Afghanistan as a result of these WikiLeaks documents. Now continue. We have examples of The Guardian being referenced, especially in relation to what happened with the password that David Lee uses as a chapter title that results in all of these cables becoming loose. There's the CNN article that's in there where they basically launder this information from UC Global and the CIA about the espionage operation against Julian Assange. And the CNN article puts a spin on all of it. They cover it much differently than Spanish newspaper El País. And they, in fact, say that this is proof that Julian Assange was using the embassy as a Russian election meddling outpost. Incredibly false, totally slanderous, and fed into a lot of the character assassination and smears that were most popular. But all of us did what we could. It's hard for me to say that I completely have followed all of the media coverage over the last 4 or 5 days, because to me, I've been reading my colleagues like you and others who I trust on this case and seeing what was put out and going back to people who I do care about their perspectives and seeing how they put this all together. So I think that, you know, one of the things that's really crucial about going forward after the Assange case is, you know, we've seen the independent media, we've seen the voices, the alternative press that are capable of doing justice to this case. And it's too bad that all of us didn't have wider audiences, because the last thing I'll say on this point is there was a polling firm called Morning Consult that did look at various countries. They looked at Australia, the United Kingdom, I believe they looked at France and Germany, and they looked at the United States, and they asked about their attitudes towards Julian Assange, the extradition case, and what people knew about the WikiLeaks publications. And it was found that only half of the United States participants knew Julian Assange. About 50% of people had never heard of Julian Assange. So one of the struggles throughout all of this campaigning wasn't just that people had propaganda on their mind, it was also that they had no idea what we were talking about.
Well, I can tell you that just about everybody in Australia has heard of Julian Assange. And I guess that's where it really counted in the end. It was a concerted effort. And, you know, when the people voted the way they did, you know, to bring Julian Assange home, there was a program called 60 Minutes. And they put out a poll, you know, should Julian Assange be brought home? It was like almost 90% of the population. Well, the survey, I should say, but that was a very widely watched program by millions. You know, there was the Belmarsh Tribunal that we did in Sydney had a tremendous effect. After that, there were like, I think 3 times, maybe 4 times as many parliamentarians joined in this Bring Assange Home movement. And it just spread throughout the parliament. It had spread throughout the population. And there's not one person that I would meet here in the street that, you know, I said, we're here for a big case. And they said, oh, is that the Assange case? So, you know, I guess he's our countryman, right? So it's been really important that Australians know about Julian Assange. But, you know, there's plenty of time to learn.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to point out the difference in how the Australian public were informed and knew about the case, whereas if you look at the UK and the US, unfortunately, it's abysmal. The media coverage and the population awareness, although it did get a bit better in the end, but still. And I think it's important also what Kevin said about how the US prosecution were just openly citing mainstream media smears in their case against Julian. Really just scandalous how complicit they've been the whole time. I think I was too soft in my question earlier when I said they had no courage. No, they were directly complicit by not covering the whole thing and smearing him the whole way through. And even right now, there's some media that are still doing that, unfortunately. But I think when we look at the plea agreement and we look at the effects that this is going to have in England, I mean, I know that I was aware of these negotiations going on, and one of the sticking points was that Julian refused to agree with anything that would endanger future journalists, right? So I think that's a very selfless thing to do, a very unselfish thing to do, a very heroic thing to do, and that needs to be mentioned. I just wanted to say that. Let me ask all of you, what do you think of the sticking points in the case? Because we know the Americans were going to lose in court. Why exactly do you think that was the case? I think that we spent 2 years now on assurances. We've kind of circled back to where we were before. And the whole question was, can the Americans be trusted? Because we know the CIA want to kill him, but that's not the question in court. The question is, can the Americans be trusted to treat him well and treat him fairly? And, I think that that was the main reason they were going to lose. And I just want to take your thoughts on it. Maybe we could start with Tareq and then Mohamed, and go kind of counterclockwise on the screen.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, well, I think the thing that sticks out to me, I think, is there was a Supreme Court precedent, I think, in a case with USAID, which basically ruled that, the precise point that the UK lawyers for Assange were arguing, that or that they will argue in the upcoming appeal, is that, you know, that Assange wouldn't have the same rights as a US citizen, and the US Supreme Court actually upheld that. So I think that's what really triggered this whole thing, is that you know, it would be very difficult for the US prosecutors from the Eastern District of Virginia to say that actually, oh yes, we will be able to give him his First Amendment rights, when the US Supreme Court has already held that non-US nationals don't have that right. Perhaps Joe and Kevin can correct me or amend my statement there if I'm slightly wrong, but that's my understanding, is that it would have been very difficult for the prosecutors to actually give that assurance.
Could I also maybe add another thing, and I'll ask, and again, Tareq, I'll start with you, is that, you know, my impression from all this is that yes, they have certain legal protections, but they don't count. They just don't matter. You know, like the really sobering thing about all this is that they can just make any treatment, any torture, any deprivation of your human rights legal whenever they want to, and then, you know, there's nothing you can do about it. And I think that's something that needs to be pointed out. And in the UK, for example, I mean, it came down to his First Amendment rights, or whether he would have them in America. But the case should have been stopped a lot earlier because of a lot of other things. And it's like they're just completely disregarded. Like, yeah, whatever. They don't matter. Would you agree with that assessment, Tareq?
Yeah, I mean, the first part of your statement, I'm not entirely sure what you were referring to, but yeah, no, I think you're completely right in terms of saying that there was probably 18 to 20 different violations that would have, you know, stopped any other court proceeding. I mean, I think the one that sticks out to most of us is the fact that his legal team and his medical team were spied on in violation of attorney-client and medical privilege, and that was completely what's the right word, absolved by the district judge, that just said, you know, actually the US was entitled to do this because, going back to Kevin's point, because of that CNN article kind of saying that he was engaged in this election interference, which obviously we know is false, but yeah, sorry, I've lost.
Let me just put this out here for everyone. This isn't my opinion, and I know that it's probably not your favorite thing, Richard, to have guests just sitting here reading from Washington Post reports, but this insider account from the Justice Department, I just want to give people a couple snippets, and I'll step back and let everyone react and give their perspectives. I don't have a lot to add. Some of these are pretty easy and self-evident quotes here, but it's basically that a British court ruled that it was preparing to send Assange to the United States if the Americans affirmed he was entitled to the same free speech protections as a US citizen. Otherwise, the judges said Assange could argue he was being discriminated against based on his Australian nationality. Then the next paragraph here says the US prosecutors said they could not and would not make that commitment. In a 2020 civil case, this is what Tareq was referring to, the Supreme Court said that foreign organizations operating abroad have no First Amendment rights. Rulings from the High Court in other cases have held that foreign nationals do not have the same free speech rights as US citizens. So then it spurred them. There was an April 4th warning that without an immediate deal, the extradition effort might collapse. Without the First Amendment assurance, one trial attorney said in an email, the British lawyers representing the US government concluded they would run into an ethical obligation to drop the case because of their duty of candor. They could no longer argue for extradition when a condition required by the court had not been met. And so it goes on, but they were asked to give an assurance that they could not give. And knowing that they couldn't satisfy the High Court, they scrambled to try and get a plea deal because they didn't want Julian Assange in an appeal hearing to prevail in that respect. So there is this actual possible future where Julian Assange's legal team are still arguing this case in an appeals court and ends up even prevailing to a greater extent. But I would also add, as like sort of an asterisk, that if he had won in an appeal, if he had actually defeated the extradition case, then all this other uncharged criminal conduct can still be brought against him separately if the Justice Department would want to try again.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Go
can I
ahead.
jump in there? So yes, continuing from that, what Kevin has said, they wouldn't necessarily be able to do it against him in the UK because the High Court will have said, well, we can't extradite him because you can't guarantee that he'll be treated equally. But if he goes to another country, he could then face exactly those additional charges. Now, in relation to the you had asked earlier, Richard, before I continue on this point, about media coverage. I would remind people, going back and continuing from what Cathy said, it wasn't just in the September hearings where the amount of mainstream media coverage dropped, as the hearings went on, because it was about 3-4 weeks of hearings from September. It ended in the first couple of days of October of 2020. There was the first week in February where a whole bunch of journalists arrived, and the first day was the prosecution case, and then they run off to file their copy, and then the next day there were far fewer. That's when I first met you in person, Kevin, because you came over for that, right? Where it was held in Woolwich, right? Belmarsh Magistrates Court held in Woolwich. And the number of journalists who were then there for the defense days where they were presenting their arguments had been reduced drastically, especially from the establishment press, right? So that's another example of them being really in it. That's because of the decline in court reporting, right?
But it reminds me of the ICC, like they broadcast Israel's defense, but nothing of the Palestinians did.
Yeah, at the International Court of Justice, exactly. But in this case, whereas that is more obvious, just bias. This is also just a reflection of the decline of court reporting, because none of those people are proper court reporters. I was in the basement of the Royal Courts of Justice after the last appeal hearings. It was in February, in the press room, and there were a couple of journalists, establishment press there. It doesn't matter which outlets, right? And well-known outlets. And one of them was saying to the other one, we're all working late at night filing copy. Kevin, I was working on the piece I sent to you. One of them was like, so how do you think the judges are going to rule? And the other one was like, I have no idea. I haven't been following this case.
Oh my
right?
God.
And I'm like, so I wasn't able to get in court, even though I have covered every single hearing, no matter how short, no matter if they're call-over hearings in Westminster Magistrates Court, all the preliminary hearings, etc. And I put this in my email to them. But these other journalists who don't know the background, the context, the details, right, have got this access. And literally, that's that conversation there. Now, I can't blame them for not following it because they're not being
Divine intervention. Kevin, could I ask you a question? Kevin,
Sorry,
you've been involved with WikiLeaks since 2010.
I froze again.
Provision of this plea deal is that Julian has had to tell Kristen, the editor of WikiLeaks, to delete unpublished files. Now, one of our readers brought up in a comment, something I'd forgotten about, this so-called insurance file, which has been misnamed a dead man's switch. I never took it seriously. I think it was some kind of bluff. I don't understand whether there is such a thing, whether these files exist, and does that mean they would have to be deleted? What could they be? And I just want to add before you answer that, to me, it would be unethical, journalistically, to hold on to material that is of public interest and not publish it immediately, and to hold it back to try to protect the editor-in-chief is something you just can't do that. So what do you know about this so-called insurance file, and will it have to be deleted if it actually exists?
So I don't know a whole lot about what WikiLeaks would still have that's unpublished. Obviously there's been so much time. This would be over like 15 to 16-year-old material we'd be talking about, especially if we're just focused on relevant material to the charges in this. I don't know, are they saying like anything from the US government before this plea deal has to be destroyed if it wasn't published by WikiLeaks yet? I don't know where they would get off trying to get Julian Assange and his team to agree to that. But from what
But
I
he
can
did
tell,
agree to it.
Yeah, it's
No, but
explicitly,
no, but
explicitly
hold on.
mentioned in the-
So my interpretation of the provision of the plea agreement is that it's just that Julian Assange had to turn to the WikiLeaks editor-in-chief, Kristen Harafson, and say, I instruct you to destroy all of the unpublished material.
Correct.
And then the editors could come back and say, okay. And all Julian Assange had to do is turn around to the court and show that he had in good faith made that request. I'm not even sure how, like, there wasn't really any process where this was verified. I mean, there's an affidavit that's submitted in court. It's not clear to me what would happen to Julian Assange if it's found that WikiLeaks didn't destroy the unpublished material. So, like,
he would go back. He would go back to the UK. That is made clear if he has.
Is it?
No, but that's
himself.
where is
yeah.
that in where is that in the plea? It does not say that he
Yes,
has
it
to.
is.
It doesn't say that he has to, that the files have to be destroyed. It says that he has to do everything he can to instruct other people to do it, not that he has an obligation to ensure that they're destroyed. Those are two different things. All he has to do is say,
just about his telling the truth.
All he's got to do is say, hey, I agreed to turn to these people and say, anything that you haven't published that is US secret files, destroy them. Okay, court, here is a document. I swear by Almighty God that I have instructed these people to destroy them. If their response is like, okay, and then they don't, well, that's got nothing to do with him, because there's nothing in the plea agreement that says they must be destroyed, because how could you impose that on an individual who does not have control over the information? All they can require of him is that he tells other people to do it. Whether they do it or not is a separate matter. Whether they can do it or not is a separate matter. One example.
But again, to what Joe was asking, what is this material that they think is unpublished? Because, you know, he's bringing up the insurance file. I'm not really sure what that would be, although it's supposed to provide WikiLeaks some protection, some kind of a way of controlling how far the US would go. But we know the fallout with Daniel Domscheit-Berg and all the destruction of documents that happened with him, right? If I understand correctly.
Bank of America, human rights abuse in Central America. He deleted all that. He said he did.
So I don't know what these unpublished materials are.
Perhaps I mean, they're just throwing that in there because they just want to make sure that that's in there, right? It's like, okay, good. We've got him to say that he's going to do it, and he did it. And Kristen Harafson confirmed to Kevin and I that he received those instructions. So that's done and dusted. One thing, I'm just spitballing here. Don't forget that the Vault 7 leaks, WikiLeaks made the decision not to. So for people who don't know, there in 2017 there was supposedly the largest ever. I say supposedly in the sense that it is the largest ever, not that it didn't happen. It did happen. CIA leak, or a leak in CIA history, and that was the CIA cyber warfare program. And you can go onto the WikiLeaks website, and I encourage people to do so, to go and look to see what all these programs do. Right? I mean, it's
fascinating.
To take over people's electronic devices, to change information, etc. It's fascinating. To take over, you know, devices that you think are switched off, but there's still electricity running through them, and switch on their mics, etc., etc. Now, what WikiLeaks didn't do was publish the computer code. And the reason they gave was, if they publish the actual computer code rather than merely the descriptions that are given as to what the programs are, that means millions of people around the world could have, certainly anyone with sufficient technical knowledge, computer coding knowledge, could then would have these cyber warfare tools. And I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing. Do you want, 1 million people around the world to be able to engage in these cyber warfare attacks, right? It's bad enough the CIA have them, right? Do you want all kinds of organized crime groups having them, and disgruntled hackers and other intelligence, the Israelis or Russians or whoever? I'm sure they've got their own stuff, but so they didn't publish that, right? They merely published the descriptions. So that might be something that they could delete, assuming they kept it to begin with, right?
Well, no, it doesn't pertain to that period, because if you look carefully, it says the information with a capital I, and the information is defined earlier on in the plea agreement with a whole set of acts and specific dates. And so it's within that time period, and that's what Barry Pollock confirmed, that these, what the information that they want deleted, that is, that they're talking about, is over 10 years old. And even if it exists today, I don't know what harm it could possibly do to the United States. They were not talking about anything from 2017.
Okay, even better. So they get to keep their cyber warfare, CIA cyber warfare code. Yeah.
Can I ask a kind of related question on all this? Because I read the plea agreement this morning, and I was a little bit shocked, actually. Not shocked, but surprised, but that there wasn't any sort of wording around, Julian not being able to be a part of WikiLeaks again, or kind of any sort of publishing activity in the future. I was just curious what.
No, there were no restrictions. There were
no.
no.
Well, they said they refused. They said that was one of the key sticking points. Like there were a number of key things that they would absolutely not agree to in order to secure a plea deal. They wouldn't agree for Julian to return to the continental United States. He refused to agree to even be escorted by U.S. Marshals on the plane, and the Americans refused for him to go on a commercial flight, which is why he had to take the private flight. And also he refused, he said there can be no further sentence, no supervision order, also no gag order of any kind, no restrictions on him of any kind, that this plea agreement has to bring a permanent end to the case with no further elements beyond that, like you can't use a computer for the next year or anything like that, right? So that they made clear that those were clear sticking points, that they would not agree to the plea. And I think if you've got a bit of leverage, because you can tell the Americans now are more enthusiastic about signing an agreement, you've got that leverage. So it's the reason it's not in there is because they would refuse to sign a plea agreement if that was to be in there.
So I guess technically speaking, Julian could return to WikiLeaks in some sort of capacity, and I don't know if he would consider even doing that, but
that's what Pollock said. Pollock said at the press conference, he said it's now up to him to decide what he wants to go on and do with the rest of his life, to whatever extent he wants to do it.
Interesting.
By the way, Cathy, did I hear your voice at the press conference? Were you at the press conference asking questions?
No.
No? Oh, there was someone I heard asking a question.
Which question was that?
We were in the Parliament House, but we could not get into the press. It was an extremely frustrating situation.
Yeah, we were downstairs.
We arrived 9 a.m. on Thursday. There was supposed to have been a press conference at 11 on Thursday. We were hoping to go to, and then we were told it was canceled. So we just went to the Parliament just to have a coffee. When we got there, we saw what was going on. So it was a complete screw up by the people we were trying to inform us about it. But Julian wasn't there. That would have been really frustrating if we weren't there to see him. And
I find it funny that the mainstream media, they've all decided to show up like as if they know anything about the case, or as if they even care. Well, in Australia, it's different because as you guys were pointing out, the level of support, level of coverage is different. But I'm speaking generally in the West.
Complicit before. Yes. You said they were complicit.
But they were complicit.
It's the Iraq War.
It's like
they're complicit with all the establishment goals.
They were.
One of them was to marginalize Julian, although there's schizophrenia in the mainstream media, in that the 5 newspapers put out that statement to Biden to drop the case. So they knew that this was a First Amendment threat to them. They understood that. Rachel Maddow, who couldn't stand him because they blame him for Trump, also said that the day he was arrested that this was a threat to us, what we do, as if she's a real journalist. So there was always this schizophrenia, this split, where they hated his guts because he showed them up, and he exposed American malfeasance and misdeeds, and the American press is there to protect and cover American misdeeds from the public by explaining it as spreading democracy, not some kind of global ambition and greed, etc., and violence. So that's why they hate his guts and they're complicit in the whole. But they realize, they looked really ridiculous, frankly. And you're right, they showed up now. And I just think this is extraordinary, this Washington Post story, to go back to that. They're admitting it now openly. They were going to lose the case. Case closed. That's why this happened.
Yeah. No, I want to just kind of circle back to what I said earlier with Mendoza. So I understood that he was asked by the Assange's legal team to come to the court because they had submitted his case files earlier when we were covering the High Court appeal, the first round, so 3 years ago, and if you recall that in the judgment, one of the justices looked at it and said, well, there's nothing wrong with the Mendoza case and there's nothing wrong with everything else, and they just hadn't had all the relevant information to make that decision, which is why I was shocked and why I published those things. And so I was really looking forward to Mendoza coming and just giving them, verbally in court, just an absolute humiliation. I mean, for that point alone, for me, I thought he was going to destroy their case, and never mind the other things that you guys pointed out, and have been pointing out, which is the corner that they backed themselves into about the First Amendment. So we have all of these things working together, and then the public pressure. And when I say public pressure, I really think it's important to thank all the activists, and thank you guys as well for all your efforts, for every line you've written or spoken in support of Julian, because you are the ones that actually got the snowball, this whole thing rolling, and got that snowball growing. And that needs to be pointed out. It's not mainstream media. They didn't lift a finger.
Yeah. No, Richard, I wanted to ask you this because you said, I'm sorry, with Mohamed, you said you wish it had gone to the High Court because had they ruled against the U.S., that would have set a precedent. Has there never been a case in Britain where an extradition was refused because the First Amendment rights or the Article 14 rights or Article 10, whatever it is in the European Convention, rights of free speech were denied the defendant? Do you know that never happened before? In other words, this would have been a precedent-setting decision.
Yeah, to the United States. Yes, because remember the arguments that they were making was very specific arguments that non-US persons can't assert. I mean, it wasn't 100% because it's never happened before, right? So this case is unprecedented. But they were saying that based on their interpretation of related cases that are not exactly on point, but are if you like to the side, like that Supreme Court case that was mentioned, for example, that speech activities engaged outside of the United States by non-US persons in national security cases, that such a person who's not a US person would not have the same rights under the First Amendment as a US citizen in the same circumstance if they're tried. So because that hasn't been raised before, then the courts haven't had to decide whether or not somebody who's going to be extradited to the United States would have be able to assert at least the same First Amendment protections at trial, because they have never needed to consider that before. So if they did say, well, it looked almost impossible that they weren't going to lose on that point, the US, because of the points they made, that would mean anybody who is then accused of violating US espionage laws by publishing national defense information would also be in the exact same position. Now, the one thing I would say is, although the High Court did not make a final ruling, so we don't have higher court precedent in the way that you would if they had, if there is a future case, if, for example, I publish something and the Americans want me, I now know what the key point is that I'm going to hit the ground running on, because there's all the other stuff that Julian lost on. Okay, right here. Well, unless the Americans can guarantee that I'll be able to assert First Amendment protections that are equal to a US citizen, you can't extradite me because I would be discriminated against, and that's not permitted under the Extradition Act. to be discriminated against at trial, or even potentially discriminated against, prejudiced at trial, based on my nationality or citizenship. So at the very least, we've got enough of that on the record that we can tell this is an issue, and a magistrate could be pointed to that. Look to see how concerned the High Court was about this. Okay, there wasn't a final resolution, but it was clearly a significant issue that had to be dealt with. So it doesn't have binding precedent, but it has persuasive, what you'd call persuasive effect, and who knows, maybe the next case will result in that. Unless
I don't think so. I don't think so, Mohamed. I spoke to Gareth Peirce, and she said that even though Dame Victoria Sharp, at the end of the renewal appeal, had got a little bit impatient and demanded a consensus opinion from both sides on whether Julian Assange would be excluded from First Amendment protection purely by way of his nationality. When I spoke to Gareth Peirce, and this was not so long ago, she said it was still unclear. Nobody knew. And, you've got a case, an unprecedented case. And, I was under the impression that Julian would lose his Article 7 rights as well. But apparently we've been told that in a criminal case that doesn't happen. Article 7 and also the Fifth Amendment relating to the unprecedented nature of this case. But apparently Article 7 rights do kick in, and Baraitser was right in assuming they did, but she was wrong in assuming that that Article 10 rights would be assured by the First Amendment, because that's really quite different. And the thing about US aid versus open society, as Bruce Afrin pointed out to us, is that is a civil case, right? Yes. But at the same time, the defense called in the expertise of that professor. I don't recall his name.
A former federal judge, actually. So that helped a lot. I think that helped to sway the judges a lot. He wasn't just a professor. He used to sit as a federal judge.
Yeah, that's right. And so there were, as Craig Murray said, there was a lot more case history that actually tended to say that Julian wouldn't have First Amendment protection. But we were going anti-clockwise. Richard, if you ask me, it comes down to a simple matter of law. Right back from Baraitser, that a decision had been made to somewhat ignore the extradition treaty. But when it came down to brass tacks, there was a violation there of domestic law. And that is the Extradition Act of 2003, Article 81B, where it was a red line. If they're going to rely on the act, the domestic legislation, then all right, okay, so political opinions, political offenses in the treaty, okay, well, we can say that's not quite the same thing. But when it comes down to it, you can't discriminate against someone by way of their gender, their race, their religion, or their nationality. And that was a red line that the judges were not willing to cross.
Well, because that's a matter of process rather than substance. So on substance, they were making all the wrong decisions, in my opinion, right? Like dismissing all these major violations, like the surveillance of lawyer-client privilege, planned assassination or poisoning, etc. But on process, so here's the thing. If, let's say, a US citizen would have rubbish First Amendment rights, right, at trial, that's fine. So as long as he gets the same terrible First Amendment rights that a US citizen would have, they'd be okay with that. They were not going to look behind at the substance. They refused to address the fairness of a jury trial, a national security jury, all of these things, right? The politically motivated offense. On the substance, they were on side with the US, destroying basically our rights here. It was just the process. They just needed to say, just tell us that he's going to get the same rights. They could be terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I'm
That
having
he'll
cut
get the
off,
same
but-
rights that a U.S. citizen. Tick that box. It's just a box ticking exercise, right? As long as you can tick the box to say that he'll get the same rights as a U.S. citizen, great. Even if those rights were terrible, they wouldn't say, well, but here in Britain, you'd have more freedom of speech protections. That's what they should be doing. But they refuse to do that. If they could tell them that they'd get the same rights, they would have sent him.
It's fundamental, isn't it, that everyone should be treated equally under the law. That is the most fundamental level. That's what you would expect. That's what our Senator David Shoebridge said. We would expect that everyone would be treated equally under the law.
Yeah, even
But
if
that
it's
wasn't
equally
the case.
terribly. Even if it's equally terribly, as long as it's equal. Right?
That's
As
what I
long
was-
as it's equal.
that's the
They
point I
didn't
was
care
raising
about
before.
how terrible. Yes, you're right.
It's that there's a total unraveling of Western judicial systems. It's just like the veil has been lifted, the veneers come off, the facade is gone. It really just shows you how unfair it is. It's like they'll make any kind of unfair treatment legal, and even this most basic box ticking exercise where they're just saying like, yeah, we'll treat you equally crap in America. They wouldn't even do that, and that goes to it says a lot about the US justice or so-called justice system, and it does say a lot about the UK as well. That it took 4 or 5 years for them to just disagree on this thing, and they let everything else go ahead. And about the Espionage Act. Julian said that in court that it contradicts the First Amendment. Okay, and the thing is, we have to talk about the Espionage Act now because and the Official Secrets Act in England, because they've been trying to make the Official Secrets Act worse. And we have also this case with Julian having the Espionage Act, or essentially judges equate the Official Secrets Act with the Espionage Act. Are there any efforts to change it? I kind of know the answer to the question already, but nonetheless, maybe we could start with Taylor.
I was muted. Just a few points that I wanted to raise, kind of picking up where the discussion had left off before your question, Richard, and that is, of course, that there have been a number of legal irregularities with this case. There's been a number of conflicts of interest with previous judges who have made decisions on this case dating back several years. This has been covered extensively, not by myself, but by Declassified UK, Matt Kennard, and the others with that organization. And then also, too, there was the blatant violation of attorney-client privilege, which took place in the Ecuadorian embassy while he was seeking asylum there. I know that this is information that all of us here are aware of, but it goes back again to, I think, not only just the overall destruction of the judicial systems within the US and the UK, but also the United States grip on the UK system, where their ability to exert their power perhaps over some of the key decisions that have been made with this case. But I actually was quite curious as to the arguments that would have been presented on July 9th and 10th. Obviously, I'm very happy that this case has not progressed and moved forward, that has come to a solution. But I would have been curious what else would have been addressed, because there was this very confusing argument with regard to citizenship versus nationality. I actually had not realized or given it much thought that these have legally, there's an argument that could be made that these two have different legal distinctions. But this is, of course, an extraordinary case in that you have the U.S. Espionage Act of 1917 applying to a foreign citizen, whereas the First Amendment likely would not apply to that individual. As far as changes to domestic law within the UK, I'm not too sure. Perhaps someone else here could pick it up. I meant more
in the US, with the Espionage Act, because the media are not going to put any pressure, I suppose, on the government to address that, even though they're concerned.
Right. I think there was some effort in the past, please correct me if I'm wrong, there was an effort in the past to allow for people to put forward a public interest defense if they were charged with espionage. I understand the sentiment of wanting to do that. I guess it's a good first step as to maybe open up this idea that we could perhaps revisit the Espionage Act, make changes to it. But I think that it is an outdated piece of legislation, and to use it against journalists, there needs to be some sort of safeguard to prevent that from happening, or for it to be used against not only journalists, but also innocent citizens for political reasons. I don't think anything came of that proposal several years ago, though, but I haven't kept up on this.
Well, I
Well,
can
Mohamed, you
jump
referred
in
an article-
here.
Sorry, go on.
Well, I just wanted to say right now, there is an Espionage Act reform bill that has been put forward. It doesn't get any traction in the Congress, which nobody here is going to find that mystifying, because we only were able to get, during the course of the Assange case, maybe a couple dozen representatives, maybe 1 or 2 US senators to actually care and pay attention, maybe have some of their staff track what was happening with the political case against Julian Assange. But Rashida Tlaib, a Palestinian American congresswoman, has been the leading sponsor to push Espionage Act reform. There are civil liberties and press freedom organizations that worked on it. My colleague, Chip Gibbons, for Defending Rights and Dissent, has worked very hard on trying to get people signed on to, well, not only support Julian Assange's freedom, but to support Espionage Act reform. I'll just tell you, and we can discuss this openly here. This is a good group of people to discuss what the reform would do. But as Taylor was saying, it's about basically saying that the journalists would be protected, that they, by having the ability to put forward a public interest defense, the use of the Espionage Act provisions would be restricted to government employees with a duty to protect classified information. So you'd have to have signed a security clearance. That was not the case here with Julian Assange. Requiring the national defense information be properly classified. That's actually true now, so I don't know really what that would change. Requiring the government prove the defendant acted with the specific intent to injure the United States or aid a foreign power, and permitting a defendant to testify as to the purpose of the public interest defense. So just offering a mechanism for going to court. However, I tend to agree with Taylor and anyone who says it should probably just be abolished. But I believe that these groups that are civil liberties or press freedom organizations working on this are fearful of a world where there is no Espionage Act, and then the national security state is emboldened to write their own security law that could leave us on a worse footing.
Kevin, in terms of, I've read a little bit about this myself, in terms of properly classified, what is meant by that is that it has not been classified for a nefarious reason in order to hide crime or embarrassment, in violation of the mythical Executive Order 13526, Section 1.7 that everybody ignores. Obama's law, where you're not supposed to do that, but it's unlawful, but it's just done. But that's what Tlaib meant by properly classified. It should be, and that it is, it's not tainted.
And also over-classification, right? Classifying something as secret when it should just be restricted, or top secret when it should be secret,
Correct.
right?
Yes.
I have a quick question about that, actually. I don't want to get too much into this legislation, but perhaps it is of interest to the group and to the listeners.
Because they're here even.
Oh, I think he was still speaking. I didn't realize.
No, it's all right. It froze. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to exit. Richard, can I exit and come back in?
Go right ahead. I'll be ready to admit you. Go ahead.
You. Continue. I'll be back.
Sure. I just had a quick question. So as I understand what you had explained, Kevin, in this proposal or reform proposal, it would grant protections for journalists. Is there any indication of how one would show that they're a journalist? Would there be some sort of established certification? Would you just have to show a press card? Because I know that in the United States, we don't have like a licensure to be a journalist, which I have always thought that was probably a good thing. Some countries do have this, I believe, but how would one assert that they are a reporter? Because my fear would be that, say, journalists, there would be a certain requirement where only mainstream journalists would be maybe offered these protections.
Okay,
Just
so
to-
let me
just to
read
throw it
you.
out.
Let me throw out there the definition that has been agreed upon, and also mention that there was an earlier iteration of this that I think was something like the Free Flow of Information Act, I believe, and it was horrible. Dianne Feinstein, a notorious kind of a senator when it came to leaks, and her visceral hatred for Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, and Edward Snowden, along with Chuck Schumer, were part of this effort to ensure that any kind of it was either with so I'm confusing this sort of with like the Shield law, but also like I'm presuming that the Espionage Act reform, when we think of covered journalists and stuff like that, that they would have the same definition. They were really hung up on making sure that there weren't any protections passed in Congress that WikiLeaks or Julian Assange could claim, or that Edward Snowden could claim. And that really affected the ability to get any good, meaningful legislation. I apologize if I'm kind of conflating the two, but I think this is actually from the Reporters Shield law that is on the up for consideration right now. And I'm just going to read the definition here because I think this is the same definition that they would use for Espionage Act reform. Covered journalist means a person who regularly gathers, prepares, collects, photographs, records, writes, edits, reports, investigates, or publishes news or information that concerns local, national, or international events or other matters of public interest for dissemination to the public. So it's a broad definition. It doesn't have anything tied to employment. It doesn't say you have to be working for a particular establishment news media organization or a legacy media, or however we want to describe them. It just says that if you could show that one of the things you do in your daily life professionally is journalism, I believe, you would be protected. That's a Reporters Shield law. So this is a law that's being considered for journalists in the United States right now. The reason why I bring it up in the context of Espionage Act reform is I presume that's what representatives and senators would agree when they're talking about how journalists could protect themselves from Espionage Act prosecutions. So somebody just regularly engaged in news gathering could probably have this benefit of the Espionage Act reform. But I mean, like, it is true that the First Amendment should protect all citizens engaged in journalism because it is part of the US Constitution. It says that everyone has freedom of the press, but it's been really difficult to help and convince senators and representatives in the United States that even just someone who works at a truck stop in the United States could be a journalist, because they have this very elite mentality that it has to be someone who calls them up from the New York Times and has their ear.
Well, shouldn't it apply to all citizens who haven't signed a non-disclosure agreement? You don't have to be a journalist. The First Amendment covers everyone,
Right.
and including government employees until they sign that non-disclosure agreement. They've given away basically that right. They have to keep it secret, and that's why the whistleblower gets arrested, and the journalist shouldn't, because they didn't steal the documents. Joe Biden himself on Meet the Press in December 2010 was asked, are you going to try to prosecute Julian Assange? And he said only if we could prove that he actually participated in stealing the documents. If it was given to him passively as a journalist, we can't do it. And they didn't do it. They didn't do it because they couldn't prove that. And then they tried this bullshit story about Chelsea, and he conspired with Chelsea to crack a password, which had nothing to do with getting the documents. And then the Siggy story, which is unbelievable, because the day we're going to bring Siggy there. I want to reveal something here to the public here. We interviewed Siggy a week or two ago because of a film that was made about him. And we were doing other interviews to put together a kind of documentary about this. And he was ready to go to court. And he was saying Julian was not a journalist. These are the stuff he was telling us. And now it's all blown up. They don't need Siggy anymore. I mean, wow. That's how desperate they were. And that computer charge has blown up into bits. It means nothing now. It never meant anything now. That's why I say it was a great victory.
That's a very important.
They did Siggy, but he wasn't up for it. He was a rotten witness. They even hid his identity from the court.
Well, you know, it's interesting that the Obama administration gets this kind of pass from the likes of us and other and Assange supporters because they didn't indict Julian. However, they did try this scheme. This was Obama's FBI to tell Iceland that they're under a cyber attack and please let us come to Iceland. The FBI showed up, and when the Interior Minister there found out, well, there was really a scam to try to frame Julian Assange. He kicked him out of the country. He was on our webcast along with the journalist what's his name?
Bjartmar.
Bjartmar was on the show. And
Alexander
that was an outrageous thing that the Obama administration tried to do. They desperately tried to get him on the computer charge, at least. And when that guy, the Interior Minister, kicked him out, that was the end of the case. It wasn't really only the New York Times problem. They were concerned about the First Amendment. They couldn't, their scheme in Iceland, which doesn't get enough attention, failed. So everyone looks bad here. Everyone looks terrible here from the U.S. side, in my view.
This is why the
Julian is
media
being feted
fail.
here as a hero.
This is why, because these types of cases require intensive scrutiny, like the type that Joe and Cathy and Kevin and so many others, although a small number, have engaged in. And with the resources that they have at the BBC, at the New York Times, and what have you, when they want to commit immense resources to something, there isn't anything that we found out. It's not like we have like a 750 IQ or we have magical powers. It's just being prepared to spend the time, energy, and effort to do it. And because they weren't, the only coverage was regurgitating the sort of press release points. So to go back to continue from the point that Joe is making, to go back to also what Richard, you asked about the media role, I recall how in 2020, when Jennifer Robinson, one of Julian's lawyers, the Australian-British lawyer, who was with him on the plane back to Australia, she had presented an affidavit, a witness statement to court, saying that, was it Dana Rohrabacher? I don't know.
Dana Rohrabacher.
Yeah. The congressman who was an ally of Trump had met Julian in the Ecuadorian embassy and had basically in her presence said, look, if you're prepared to reveal the identity of the source for the DNC leaks, right? Because you've said that it's not a state actor, it's not Russia, it's not a state actor. If you're prepared to reveal their identity, there could be a pardon and an end to the extradition case in the offing, right? Now, the way the media represented that, including Reuters by Tareq said he's got to head off. See you later, Tareq. Let's catch up soon, actually. The way the media represented it was Trump offered to pardon Julian if he lies about Russian involvement. Right. And so it's angles like this clear. And it's also, this is the kind of thing that turned lots of people against Julian, and particularly in the United States, was this manufactured idea that somehow some WikiLeaks releases, and most people don't even know who WikiLeaks are responsible for Hillary Clinton losing the election, even though the only reason anyone even knew anything in the States about WikiLeaks publications was because the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times published it. So why are you blaming WikiLeaks? You're the ones who chose to make it, who thought that this was in the public interest. Like, nobody knows. You know, there are 100 million, whatever, 300 million Americans. They're not going to WikiLeaks website to read what they're publishing. They're reading what newspapers are choosing to publish, right? And if you...
Yeah, I think people also had very strong beliefs in 2016, and there was nothing that was going to sway their view. People were either very pro-Clinton,
you go, Ben, Trump offered...
them both. Oh, you cut out, Mo, I'm sorry.
Exactly. No, but exactly. But what you said is exactly on board. And if you go and you type into Google or a search engine, you will see it says, like, from Reuters, from all of the establishment outlets, right, that if some of them, Daily Beast, I think, might have gone so far as to say if Trump offered Julian a pardon if he agreed to lie about Russia involvement, like literally over and over and over again.
So
dishonest, like that.
All this stuff,
right? And so it's just. Yeah, willful misrepresentation, or all it takes is a wire agency like AP or Reuters to do a rubbish job, and then because they're not, Yeah, because they're not following it properly like we are. And I was there writing out like, no, like the statement is a matter of public record. Like we're there. I interviewed Robinson, like you have her documents, right? Just read what it fucking says. And she never said that would, so all of it was catered in a way, or so much reporting, until it became more and more obvious that their heads would be on the chopping block. And I know how it's been said here that everyone knew from the get-go this was a threat to them. What I'm going to say is double hearsay now. So I'm saying what someone told me that someone else told them, right? That it was a lawyer at the New York Times, a key lawyer at the New York Times, who had to tell senior editors that actually this case posed a major threat and that they should sign a public statement going against the prosecution. That the lawyers there had to kind of give a reality check to some of the key people, some of the key journalists who, yes, hate Julian and wanted to consider themselves as not being under threat, because it took a long time for the New York Times and other outlets to really get on board after they threw him under the bus and got Pulitzers for publishing. I think they got awards for publishing materials that was as a result of WikiLeaks forcing all this media to collaborate. So I think that's worth
what's funny? You want to have a laugh? The only paper that actually did any half decent coverage of the trial was the Daily Mail. Can you believe that? I'm talking about the Old Bailey. This is like back in 2020 when we had these 3-4 weeks. They're the only ones who actually covered it even half decently. Everybody else, there was no coverage.
Evening Standard. I think there was a Standard reporter on that.
Oh, okay. My bad. But I just the funny thing is just that the Daily Mail would come and do that, and then all of these people, serious organizations or people who like to call themselves serious at the BBC and look down on everybody else, they didn't do anything. Something I'll just add as well, going back to Espionage Act and all these things, is that I'll argue another perspective. It's like, who cares about US laws? Because, if you're not in America, if you're not in the United States, and you're not from the United States, what right do the United States have to come and put you in a box? I mean, it's not like he, did a cyber attack or something, and they claim that he tried to hack because that's the only thing that they could possibly do to get him to the US, right? But then, of course, most of their case did not hinge on that. It hinged on the Espionage Act. And I find this outrageous because, if you signed a document when you join as a soldier or as an analyst or you join an intelligence agency, you're a government employee, and you break that, fine. This is another discussion. But even then, you shouldn't be persecuted. There's a big difference. And Julian never signed anything. And I think that the British government just allowing all of this to be presented at all, it's so insulting, really insulting.
That's the answer to your question, Richard. The Home Office, they're the ones who cared about the extraterritoriality of the U.S. law. They could have said, go away. It's not our law. We don't care. He didn't break any British law. We're not extraditing. But they did take it seriously. Yeah.
Yeah, because they don't like the fact that he published it. Right.
Remember, they hated him as much as the Americans did.
Exactly. Because they're
how do you think Alan Duncan feels today, by the way? Seeing Julian be free and on the tarmac hugging Stella. I bet you he's not popping corks today, is he, like he did that day?
and believe it or not, he's one of the better Tories as well.
Only
How does Keir Starmer feel?
Yeah.
How does Keir Starmer feel, who's CPS told Sweden, don't you dare get cold feet?
God, I mean, what a political system, really. I mean, any proper Home Office, a real Home Office, would be proud to have Julian Assange. Would say this guy's a national treasure. We will protect him at all costs.
Well, don't forget that, like the National Security Act, and I wrote a detailed piece for Consortium News about this, and I'm very grateful that Joe supported me throughout that. It ended up being the longest article I ever wrote, far longer than I intended. I expected to get an angry phone call. Actually, this is like 1,000 words longer than you promised. But the very frightening national security, it was a bill at the time, it's now an act. It was inspired at within the context of the WikiLeaks publications and then the Snowden, especially the Snowden publications. And when you looked at the debate within Parliament, WikiLeaks was mentioned like a number of times, and the idea of like them dumping and harming people, dumping information and harming people. And if you read, there are extraterritorial elements now to the National Security Act. It's very clear that they've been looking at what the US are doing with their Espionage Act, and they said, great, how can we make our official secrets national security legislation even more draconian?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And they passed a whole range of laws like this. You know, in the last years, man, I mean, Suella Braverman and Patel, they really like made sure to screw up the country for generations to come. They, you know, they did all sorts of things, nationality and borders bills, all sorts of draconian laws that really no one needed at all.
Remember, though, it's Parliament that passed them. So sometimes we can get lost in the individuals. We can talk about how Thatcher did this, or Tony Blair did that.
Labour Party allowed this to go through unchallenged on every one of these bills. And
also the Tory MPs need to be held accountable. There were times where being a conservative did not necessarily mean that you supported mass surveillance, right? Like, being conservative means you should oppose those things. It's like these
ironically
terms have been flipped on their head.
Ironically enough. No, I just meant it when they were Labour. They were actually Labour supporting Tory bills unchallenged.
Oh, right, yeah. Either voting in favor, and in many cases they were, like the National Security Act, or abstaining, or even when they vote against, it's not just the voting against. It's how much pressure do you put? So if someone looks at your voting record and be like, oh, they vote well. But what do you know about, are they going out to the press and making a big deal? Are they going to their constituents and making a big deal about this? Are they actually fighting it? Or are they just want to be on record as voting against, but having put no pushback? Because enough pushback, as we've seen in this case, at the end of the day, even if a bill has, remember the vote to bomb Syria?
Yeah.
They were sure they had it in the bag. In the end, there was so much public pressure calling up members of parliament that they ended up voting against the bill. And that meant, because Obama didn't want to be seen, and I think partially Obama also didn't want to bomb Syria, but he was being pushed into doing it. He definitely didn't want to be seen to be doing it without Britain. So then it didn't happen. I mean, don't get me wrong, they invaded the country anyway by proxy and sent in tens of thousands of weapons and bombs, etc. But I just mean that act, there was going to be a strike, airstrikes, and they didn't happen because there was sufficient pushback.
Mohamed,
and it looked like a foregone conclusion.
I think it was with you. We talked about all these bills, and there was also the Overseas Operations Bill, which is another genius thing they pushed through, where they basically gave British soldiers who commit war crimes immunity if the statute of limitations is 5 years, I think, or something like that, which is ridiculous, right? Because they were basically shielding anyone from being prosecuted for Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria included as well. So that's just disgusting, because I think we focus a lot on Julian and freedom of the press, because we all care about these things and hold them dear, but we kind of forget that if there's real criminality to be discussed in this case, it's the murder, the torture, and none of that is ever focused on. Why do you guys think that is?
I want to bring up one point. I'm sorry, not to answer your question, Richard, but just on the point
go ahead.
Further draconian legislation with regard to media and the press and publishing. One piece of legislation that has not gotten enough attention, I don't think. I wrote it about a year ago. This was when it wasn't fully passed, but it's the European Media Freedom Act. And what this does is it establishes a new European Board for Media Services, which will be overseen by the European Commission, to centralize the entire media sector within the EU to be overseen by this new European Board for Media Services. It will heavily monitor the media. It will also give additional powers to these very large online platforms. That would be YouTube, Rumble, Google as well, Twitter, now X, TikTok, all of these different platforms. Further permission to restrict, remove content that goes against the establishment narrative. I know that that's already happening right now in the EU, but this is being put forward and is passed as a regulation, whereas previous media law has always been a directive. So again, I'm just kind of summarizing it here in a very basic way. There's a lot to it, But this also does put into law, it allows for surveillance of journalists. It does offer some protections. It says that surveillance of journalists should not happen, but should the governments have a reason to suspect that perhaps you're engaged in illegal activity, they have a right to just deploy spyware on your devices. They also have a right to deploy spyware on those that you associate with, that you work with, your family members, and
this feels very
those that you are-
retroactive. Like I feel like they're already doing these things. I know they're doing these things, and they just want to like protect themselves.
Yes, and they put it into law now, so I think it gives them more of an authority to do so. But it's the European Media Freedom Act,
Yeah.
and it has nothing to do really with media freedom. I will say that.
Yeah, by the way, the significance of it being a regulation, Taylor, means it has what they call here direct effect, whereas a directive has to be transposed into domestic law. So the EU can pass a directive, and then each country in the EU can decide how they want to incorporate that within their domestic law. A regulation has direct effect, which means when it's a good law, like consumer protection, because the EU can have decent or much certainly better than domestic UK consumer protection laws, that has direct effect everywhere. When it's a bad law, like the one that you described, it has direct effect everywhere as well.
Exactly. And this is unprecedented for the media sector within the EU. I spoke to the executive director of the European Magazines Media Association. He is very much against this. His name is Ilias Kontias. They are all against this, and said that this is not good for the media. There's also been questions as to the legality of bringing forth media legislation in this way as a regulation, because the media sector within the EU has always been, it's been left to the member states to determine how they want to regulate the media sector within their own countries. So this is not a good way forward, but unfortunately, this proposal is going to be fully implemented by August of 2025.
It'll be challenged at the European Court of Justice. It'll have to be as violating some of the fundamental principles of rights and freedoms within the EU Charter, because there is a separate document that's not the European Court of Human Rights. That's something else. There is a separate document which guarantees rights and freedoms, which is actually superior because it's a newer document. It was it in 2009, post-Lisbon Treaty, that the EU Charter I forgot what it's called, but it is like freedoms and principles and what have you. But the problem is it will have a deleterious effect long before it is able to be challenged. Luckily, there are large unions. Journalistic unions are probably going to have to be the ones that bring the case. So it's and by the way, Richard, in relation to that overseas bill that you were talking about, it doesn't only create a statute of limitations for prosecuting Brits for war crimes. It also, among other things, restricts British soldiers from bringing claims against the Ministry of Defence, because there had been previous. So the funny thing was, it was sold to the public as protecting British soldiers from spurious prosecutions, when in fact a chunk of it is about protecting the Ministry of Defence from lawsuits from British soldiers saying that their human rights were violated by certain policies, because courts here have determined that the Human Rights Act applies both to occupied peoples, like Iraqis could bring cases, which is amazing, under the Human Rights Act. Another reason why the Tories don't like it. But also by soldiers, that the Ministry of Defence has a duty of care to soldiers, and that the Human Rights Act can apply. So it's
they just want to save money.
Another media fail.
Kevin, you covered the trial of Chelsea Manning, and again, that's another gross miscarriage of justice. I know you can obviously make the case that she leaked directly, but again, she was persecuted. I think that's very important to point out. You were there. You covered that court-martial, and again, I just to go back to my question: why do you think it is that there's so much focus on attacking and persecuting people who blow the whistle, journalists, but not people who and people who commit these crimes? Like, for example, in the collateral murder video, I don't think there's any person in that entire affair who's ever faced any form of consequences, or or had to pay damages in any regard, and that extends to all of the WikiLeaks revelations. Why do you guys think that society is that way in the West?
Well, so I'd say the very aggressive nature of that prosecution was because between Chelsea Manning and WikiLeaks, they had just thrown so much primary source information out there that allowed the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and everyone to understand what was happening in the amount of civilian deaths and the kind of torture and war crimes that were unfolding in it. But beyond that, I think, if you look at who in the past few days is still fighting this case, is still defending it, you didn't get a defense of it from the Justice Department. If you look at their press release, not a single high-ranking official or a lead attorney who worked on this put their stamp on it and said, we did this. We got this plea deal. Job well done. Attorney General Merrick Garland, actually, he was asked and he just sort of like shuffled it off. He says, well, we always have these kinds of negotiations. This is what happens with defendants sometimes. That was his very wimpy kind of comment about taking responsibility. It's the State Department, the U.S. State Department, and they have been most, I guess, defensive about this, especially in those briefings where the reporters ask, how can you continue to prosecute Julian Assange when you stand up here and say journalism is not a crime, and there's no irony in your voice at all as you speak it. And so I think the reason why those cables were so damaging to the United States is because they threw open the entire, this was, the empire has no clothes now, basically. You could see everything about how it functions. Those over 250,000 cables are actually more damning to the United States than anything we learned about the Afghanistan or Iraq wars. And I would say even more so than the detainee files, the thing about the Guantanamo Bay prisoners, it was important to see that, but those were all files that collected false intelligence about those people who were rounded up and shipped to this gulag. What we knew that already, that they were mostly innocent, that only like a handful of them had any involvement in serious violent terrorism, because even under George W. Bush, it started to release hundreds and hundreds of people from the prison. They couldn't keep them in the detention facilities or the camps there any longer. So, what happened with Chelsea and then what spilled over into Julian Assange's, or continued into Julian Assange's prosecution, is this fact that, they weren't going to be able to allow someone to get away with this. It's the whole concept of making an example out of a person. Every single Espionage Act prosecution builds on the one before it, and it continues to add to the prosecutorial power of the Justice Department. But the thing is that, and this is something that Daniel Ellsberg would say, I believe, if he was alive right now to celebrate in this moment, Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, they have a really hard time defending their actions out in the open. And just look at the ghoulish figure that is Matthew Miller, who was against this prosecution before he was forced to be for it as a Biden administration official. He actually said that he was quoted in the Washington Post article where we get the First Amendment problem, the New York Times problem that was described there. And now he's standing before the State Department and telling reporters that WikiLeaks caused harm. And as they challenge him on what he's saying, he goes, oh, well, I wasn't there 15 years ago, because he doesn't know. He has no idea what he's defending. And these people who are paid liars, they're there for the national security state. The national security apparatus wants these cases by the Justice Department to be brought because they recognize it as a threat to their dominance.
Yes, and as Caitlin Johnson said, he who controls the narrative controls the world. And the big problem with WikiLeaks was that it was very good at short-circuiting these narratives. Folks, the jet lag is getting the better of me. We just arrived in Australia and we're, 10-hour time difference. I don't know about you, Joe, but I'm wilting. But
Yeah.
I just, I wanted to leave you with one final souvenir from the Royal Courts of Justice. And it's very telling. It's a very telling souvenir of why Julian Assange won. So here it is, folks. It's, hang on, I've got to turn off my background.
No, sorry, the assurances.
Yeah.
Yeah, just let me turn off the background. So where are we? I haven't got my.
I have to say that background is very well done, Cathy. I didn't
Oh,
even
thank you very
realize.
much.
I didn't
Thank you.
realize it was superimposed. I thought it was some poster behind you originally.
No. It's something I whipped up today. You know, because of there's been these lovely images of that made everyone cry, including me. Actually, we were in Hong Kong airport, and
This is not a dream.
we saw.
Show them the assurances, Cathy.
So, you know, it is, folks, it's a toilet roll, and they were handing these out at the, and our friend Orlando Harrison from Alabama 3, who does a lot of filming for us now and some interviews, he happens to be very good at it, but he's a superb musician. Alabama 3 did the New Year's Eve concert for Julian. But somebody gave him this, and I just eyeballed it, and he said, "You want it, don't you?" And I said, "Yes."
It's worth a lot more than an American
I
assurance.
will
That. You can actually do
treasure
something.
it.
You can actually do something with that valuable. and useful,
You're
but
right,
not
Joey.
the-
This
the
one's actually
American
useful.
assurance.
There you go. That's what I think of their narrative.
Where's Gordon Crumberg tonight, Kevin?
Yeah.
I
Where is
found
he?
He's in a bar somewhere with Sal and Duncan, and they're getting drunk. And Duncan, who's keeping his pelican ties in his closet, he'll never take them out
Yes.
again.
Where's Mike Pompeo? Where is he? He was so huffy and confident about going after Julian Assange in those speeches. They're a hostile intelligence service. And then when Michael Isikoff did that story about him, and he was so just irritable and defensive, and nothing, not a peep.
Well,
Just all they have is sad Mike Pence. We just got sad Mike Pence.
But
Cathy,
the issue is here,
How does
what
Kronberg feel
Julian,
tonight?
what Julian revealed, will that get a bigger audience? Will people understand that now? Or because they got this plea where he did plead guilty to one thing, they're going to use that to call him a convicted felon, to try to smear him. It's already started. And I don't know whether the work of WikiLeaks will penetrate the larger public now. But this would be the moment for that to start to happen, because the guy's really been exonerated.
with that said,
I mean, or if I could just quickly say that I saw the kind of like deathmatch style argument show that Piers Morgan put on with Judge Andrew Napolitano, and the point that he was making is just that, like, this is a plea deal. There's a ton of people in the United States every day that plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit.
Right.
Julian Assange is pleading guilty to a crime he didn't commit so he can be free. It was transactional. And I don't know. I don't know for certain.
I don't agree.
that
I don't agree. If you read what Julian said, did you read what he said? It's in the plea agreement. He is
but
saying
it's not a
that
crime.
he did obtain and disclose information. He believed that was protected by the First Amendment, but apparently it violates the an espionage statute. But there is obviously a contradiction between these two. And what Julian is doing, he's actually reiterating the position
Yes.
of the judges in the High Court. We thought that his trial in the US was going to finally trigger this battle between the Espionage Act and First Amendment, and hopefully Julian's case, he would be martyred to save the First Amendment. But in fact, that didn't need to happen. they started it. The judges started it by rejecting, this notion that, well, you can, and it all came back down. I think it did actually come, even though it was Article 10, which protects everyone, right? But the US law is different. I think it basically did come down to domestic legislation, but they weren't going to let that pass. And what they realized was that this Espionage Act, there was incoherence here. It's incoherent.
It's unconstitutional, but it remains on the books. That
Yeah.
unconstitutional part of the Espionage Act remains on the book. And therefore, technically, he committed a crime. That's an unconstitutional law, based on unconstitutional part of the law.
But this is right. Of course, it's unconstitutional. But then you
I
have
hope
this
that
absolute gem.
His plea would start this debate. That would require the mainstream media to pick this up. And I don't see them doing that.
Yeah, but my point is, you had this gem. Don Chipton calls it this gem, this jewel of the United States Constitution, which is the First Amendment. Other countries don't have this.
Yeah.
And so how can you have an Espionage Act and a First Amendment at the same time? This is what Julian was pointing out. It is totally incoherent. This is what the judges recognize.
Because it's a wartime, it was a wartime law. And when there's war going on, I mean, Wilson tried to get censorship. There was one senator on the committee that voted against. He almost got formal censorship into that law. Completely, prior restraint. So this is a remnant of that First World War still. That a period of clamping down on free speech.
Yeah.
And it carries a death penalty if it's during wartime as well.
They were going after Eugene Debs as well back then.
I mean, he might have won at the Supreme Court, right? But you're talking about 3, 4, 5 years. You're in custody
years.
there, right? You're in custody before even the trial happens. So the whole point is the process is the punishment, right? So regardless of whether or not you finally get it reversed and you're now the age of 70 or whatever the case may be, right? Luckily for him, the rule here prohibits the possibility of prejudice at trial. Not that one day sometime in the future you might be exonerated when, I don't know, 12, how many on the Supreme Court is it, judges? 11 oligarchs sitting on a bench somewhere wearing robes happen to interpret the Constitution in one way versus the Constitution in another way. I mean, it could have 4 different judges by the time it goes up there. So it's the practicality of it. I never wanted him to go there because I always figured he'd be thrown into some hole, which was one of the real concerns, and they admitted they would, in solitary confinement. I mean, he had a mini stroke here. He was so sick, he was coughing so hard he fractured a rib or ribs. What would it be like all the way in the States? So that's really the concern. If he was going to be released on his own recognizance and he would be able to be free in some beautiful suburb while he's challenging his conviction up to the Supreme Court, then it might not be as bad. It'd be still terrible. But really, the reason most people plea in the States, isn't it? One of the reasons is you get overcharged.
Yeah.
They say, we'll charge you with 36 things. You face 500,000 years in prison, or you'll plead guilty to one thing and you get off with time served. It's like, well, you're just coercing people into, well, of course, are you going to risk, what's the conviction rate at federal court? Set aside even the espionage court in the Eastern District of Virginia, which I think is 100%.
Almost
It's like 97%. Yeah.
And that's just federal trials generally. That's not even before a national security jury under the
He's bombed
That's
out.
one
Look,
way to
I'd
go.
just like to say that
I want to
even
drink to
though,
Julian's freedom here.
even though Mohamed says, he pled guilty to something he didn't do, I think the whole beauty of Julian's...
Technically, that was Kevin, but okay.
Oh, sorry, Kevin, sorry. The whole beauty of Julian's guilty plea is actually a lesson. It's actually a lesson. He's saying, yes, that's right, I did this, and you say it's that, but there's something wrong there. There's absolutely, you have to resolve this contradiction. And
let me ask all
that
of you.
is the triggering.
Let me ask all of you something.
This debate.
Let me ask all of you, what is the ripple effect here? Is this going to have a good effect on, you know, people who are political prisoners in the United States? There are many of them, you know, political prisoners in the West. Do you think there's going to be a ripple effect? I'm not speaking in the legal domain, but rather in activism, in independent media. Do you think that this is going to embolden people to, you know, fight people who are persecuted by the U.S. empire, and especially now in the context of, you know, everything that's happening in Gaza and all the people that are still stuck in the U.S., you know, like Leonard Peltier. Just, you know, just briefly, right? And any other closing statements you guys have. So because I just want to go, you know, around the table one last time and give all of you an opportunity to speak.
Can I just go first, because I really have to go to sleep?
Of course,
Look,
of course.
I suppose we're in a bit of a rabbit hole with the Espionage Act. But I do hope that it helps Rashida Tlaib and Senator Ron Wyden, who had attempted to introduce modifications before that. I hope it triggers a consciousness and awareness. I think maybe that's something that we can push to the activist community in the United States, elsewhere, because everybody is communicating with each other now, and they're realizing that there needs to be some kind of resolution of this contradiction, that either we have a free press, and I'm not, when I say we, I'm talking about the, you know, us Westies, AUKUSes people. But when you look, Richard, when you get to the kinds of terrible, like the terrible atrocities that are being committed in the Middle East, I mean, this madness, this behavior, I feel it's like it's totally out of control. And the only way I can relate to it is because I grew up in Belfast. I was born and grew up in Belfast, and I lived there during the Troubles for a few years before my family went to Australia. And I just saw people doing mad things, you know, heinous acts, and blowing people up just because, you know, they were different. And it wasn't what it seemed to be. It wasn't about religion at all. It was more about inequality, land grabs, and all that kind of thing.
Yes.
It's the basest of instincts. You know, it's back-brain behavior. It's human beings gone completely out of control. And, you know, I think that there has to be some kind of spiritual inspiration for all of them, a voice that unites these people in peace. You know, maybe a Nelson Mandela, or you know, certainly not the kind of people who are in government in power in Israel. But, you know, it's I think we've all come to realize that it's much worse than that, because the population are all for it. And, you know, you go, oh my God, this is such a fucking nightmare. It makes all these sort of nuances between the First Amendment and Espionage Act seem so trivial. And, you know, if Julian was in this debate with us tonight, he, you know, I had a discussion with his mother, you know, she was kind of worried that people were drifting off onto other issues. And I said, for God's sake, Christine, well, I didn't use her name because she doesn't use her real name. For God's sake, if Julian was here, he'd feel exactly the same way. He'd be saying exactly the same thing. He'd be worried about the same things that we are. And
I
she
feel
said,
that too.
I know.
Yeah,
I know.
I feel that's the same. Yeah, and we should be doing something all together with him one day, God willing. What do you think, Joey? Will it have a good ripple effect? This, you know, Julian getting his freedom and embolden other activists and help them fight for other political prisoners?
I think as we witness in real time a genocide, and we understand that we're not so modern and progressive. The age-old crime of genocide goes forward. And as NATO and the United States push Russia more and more towards a possible nuclear confrontation, we have Julian Assange being released. It could be a sign of a new world as the old one dies if we don't get all killed first by it. So this is a very hopeful sign in the most dreadful time that we're living right now. And we do hope that he gets back into doing the job that he did, that he gets stuff being leaked to him, because it could have a profound effect on these two crises in particular. And that's what I'm hoping for. So will it help other political prisoners? I think if the United States sees that they could lose in court, they're going to come to a deal. And that's what happened here. It's very practical.
I'm much more likely now to publish government secrets now that I know that I could be prejudiced at trial in the United States.
Go out and get them. Give them to us.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, to answer your question, Richard, at the end of the day, nothing happens automatically, right? People have to coalesce and say, like, okay, you may think this is all done and dusted, and on a certain level it is, but what, as Cathy said, actually pointed out quite well, that what Julian did was he didn't admit to doing something he didn't do. He did do it, what he admitted to. It's just the framing of it as being a criminal offense, right? Which is what's problematic. So when Eugene Debs gave a speech saying that working class people are those who are forced to fight and kill and die in these wars, so it should be the working class who decide whether these wars happen, and he was arrested, prosecuted, and convicted under the Espionage Act as it was amended under the Sedition Act, and many others. About around 3,000 people were prosecuted and convicted under the Espionage Act during World War I, primarily for their anti-war activities, right? Their opposition to U.S. involvement in the First World War. This was during the first Red Scare. It was a good way to purge society of the left at the time, because the left were prominent in being anti-war, anti-involvement in the First World War. He did give that speech. It's not that he didn't give the speech. It's just that that speech was interpreted as being capable of falling foul of the law and resulting in imprisonment. And he was imprisoned. He ran from prison, and he won, was it 1 million votes? Right?
Yeah.
Without Twitter.
Again now.
Didn't they take away citizenship as well?
You can't. What was his other citizenship? You cannot. I don't think the United States strips citizens to make them stateless. Certainly not if you are of Anglo origin, right? I mean, granted.
No, they took his citizenship away. Yeah.
Who? Eugene
Debs? Yeah.
What citizenship did he have? What other citizenship did he have?
U.S. citizenship.
But you can't. You can't.
I'm telling you, man. I'm telling you, they did. It's insane.
Okay, I'd have to look into that, because he was either pardoned or had his sentence commuted after the war. So I'd have to look into that. I don't know that the United States does strip people of their citizenship unless it's been deemed to be fraudulently obtained. But that was over 100 years ago, so I wasn't around. I'd have to look it up.
So what you say, Richard, is, I think, a good point of ending and considering what was accomplished with freeing Assange and how it could spill over into other struggles to free political prisoners like the ones that you named. I'm aware that all these hundreds of thousands, well, maybe not as many, tens of thousands of people that were engaged on a daily basis with Assange campaigning, they no longer have to work for freeing Julian Assange. So I am going to be interested to see where some of these people who were organizing pop up, and who, they might be helping to free from the clutches of the U.S. empire, because I think that is a very worthwhile thing for them to be doing. If I could just close, I just want to highlight an act of generosity that meant a lot to me following this case. And it's a story that Craig Murray would tell. It's a story that Rebecca Vincent of Reporters Without Borders would tell. And it was that of people who were in London that would go stand in line so that people could get seats in the
Exactly.
public gallery who deserved to be there. That always really moved me as somebody who was concerned about media access, and the way that the royal courts and the administrative courts office for His Majesty's Courts and Tribunals Service was basically making it very difficult for open justice to be a thing. And these, some of them were pretty old, actually. You know, they weren't the youngest people all the time that would go out and stand in the rain, in the cold, get up at 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning, stand and wait for hours. And, you know, for me as an American, the only time this ever happens in the US is when people are waiting for like a sale at the big box store, at the, like the department store. Excuse me. Like the new iPhone is coming out or something like that. But here we had people who were selflessly standing in line so that people like us and human rights observers could go in and bear witness to the slow killing of Julian Assange. Now, here we stand today celebrating that Julian Assange survived, walked out as a free man. And I'll maintain forever and ever that this was a massive defeat for the CIA, the FBI, the Justice Department's National Security Division, the Eastern District of Virginia, and all the players involved that truly wanted to see Julian Assange brought to the U.S. and put on trial, but were deprived of it. They lost. This was not how they wanted it to end. We got the victory. They took the loss.
Here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great
sticks. That would happen.
Yeah. Great statements from everybody. I'll also weigh in with some final thoughts here and just what I could see happening moving forward. I think we are absolutely at a pivotal moment here. We have this release of a political dissident, a journalist, a publisher who's been held in some form of confinement for almost 15 years, now being released. He has a powerful voice. And I think this also encourages people to speak out and stand on the right side of history on a number of issues. And this case was so fundamental to any other cause that any of us could be involved with that's related or unrelated, because our ability to fight for anything has to start with our ability to have access to truthful information, which again goes to the heart of this case. This case impacted everybody, not just journalists, activists, political dissidents, but it impacted the public's right to know and have access to truthful information. So we can either see in the coming years that the United States perhaps wants to distance itself from this case, not move forward with additional prosecutions in this manner, or they will try to do so. We will see more people try to engage in honest, truthful, and very brave journalism, exposing power structures, wrongdoing, torture, etc., like Assange had done. And I think that the first step in getting in one of those two directions, with the second one obviously being the best option here, is to have a pathway towards positive changes by what we do here and those who are listening right now, what they do, and also where they put their energy. Do you want to put your energy into mainstream media, or do you want to help out, watch, promote new media? Do you want to be funding the systems that continue to destroy and oppress us, or do you want to put your energies towards the good? And I think that we all have little decisions that we can make each day to make that difference, and also surrounding ourselves in positive communities that help us get towards that direction. I would also say to those who maybe want to pursue a career in journalism, here we're all journalists here, reporters. Again, you don't have to go to school to be a journalist. You don't have to do any of the traditional stuff. All you need to do is be curious, have an open mind, and want to seek out the truth. And I think we could all here say that it's been very difficult at times to cover this case, but it's been very rewarding, and this job was absolutely necessary to get factual information out and available to the public. That, in addition to a number of other activities from activists, the lawyers, professional campaigners, various media entities and press freedom organizations. It was this collective effort of all of us together that got us to this point today. And so each of us have a choice to make as to how we want to continue to have victories like this one, like the release of Julian Assange, and we'll strive for that in other areas in our lives, in our world. So we have a moment now to continue on this pathway I, of course, don't want to ignore the mass atrocities going on in the world right now, in the Middle East and elsewhere. But let's take this moment to realize that nothing is beyond our reach if we continue to persevere.
Here,
But-
here.
Good statement.
Thank you, Taylor. It was very, very, very nicely said. Mohamed, did you get a chance to jump in? I just kind of, wanted to go around the table.
All I'll say is, if someone's an aspiring journalist, one thing I would certainly suggest is that as along the way they should read as much as possible. So you don't need a degree. I wish I had taken shorthand. Actually, that's the one thing I wish I had learned how to do. But no, you don't need a degree in journalism.
Avoid one, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. And in fact, most journalists, I mean, even the idea of a journalism degree is a relatively new concept in the field. I don't have. I was originally in the practice of law, and I sort of fell into journalism. But reading helps. Read about what's happened before, so that you're more knowledgeable, you're less surprised, and more capable of being critical. There's so much fascinating materials. I'm reading a book right now from a CIA whistleblower, Philip Agee, which is absolutely brilliant. And he's literally going into detail that I don't think you could go into detail now, because there are laws that have been passed. For example, you're not permitted to name the names of CIA officers now, whereas
they have these book reviews for these things. I remember.
Yeah. But no, that's it. I agree with what Kevin said. I agree with what Taylor said. I agree with what Cathy said. And Joe, any final words from Joe? Because I've got nothing left to say. I think there's nothing left.
Well, let me just say that I'm grateful to all of you, and if it weren't for the work that you did and all the independent media did about Julian in court, he wouldn't have been freed. He just wouldn't have been freed, because there wouldn't have been any information available to the public for them to even act and then go out and protest and put that pressure on parliamentary groups or on creating parliamentary groups for Julian anywhere in Australia and Britain and America and around the world. And indeed, there were many avenues of support later on for Julian, but it all started with you guys. And it's been an honor to fight alongside you. It's been an honor to be in court with you in those early morning sessions, and in person or virtually, and always happy to see you there, even though what we were covering wasn't necessarily happy at all. But we always understood the importance of it, and I'm so grateful for all the work you've done. And if we had to do it all over again, I'm sure we would. But thankfully, Julian is free, and hopefully we can concentrate our efforts on other similar matters that need our attention. And I'm certain that we all will. So thank you very much. Again, thank you to Tareq for always putting the documents up on his website and being extremely surgical and clinical in that. And thank you to Taylor Hudak, to Kevin Gosztola, to Mohamed Elmaazi, to Joey Lauria, to Cathy Vogan, to Stefania Marizzi, to every single person who was with us, to Martin, and of course Dustin, and all the journalists that cover this, also not just in English, because we had journalists coming in and doing it also in German when there was almost no one covering it in German, right? So that was very, very important, and I'm grateful to them for everything they did. So again, with that said, we can celebrate. Julian Assange is free, and it's all thanks to these journalists who in new media and independent media covering his case that he is free. And I hope that we all get to sit down as we did today, but with Julian present, as I think it would be a very interesting conversation and not just some lame mainstream media interaction. Thank you guys very, very much. I really appreciate your time and coming on.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for your work as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Bye all.
Thank you guys. Take care. Bye-bye. Cheers. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Yeah, my screen froze just as you were saying goodbye.